What if the most beautiful buildings in your city were actually prisons? Victorian asylums looked like castles. Grand Gothic towers, manicured gardens, ornate stonework that screamed prosperity and care. The Kirkbride plan promised moral treatment in architectural paradise. But step inside those elegant doors and you'd find something that would haunt your nightmares forever. These weren't hospitals. They were human warehouses where doctors played God with treatments so barbaric they'd make medieval torture look merciful. Families paid good money to disappear their problems. Eccentric aunts, depressed wives, rebellious daughters. Once those iron gates closed, patients rarely saw the outside world again. The Victorian era promised progress, civilization, scientific advancement. Instead, it delivered systematic brutality dressed up in medical terminology. What happened behind those beautiful facades reveals the darkest chapter in mental health history. The asylum business boom. Victorian Britain discovered gold, and it wasn't in the ground. It was in madness itself. The 1845 County Asylums Act didn't just mandate care for the mentally ill, it created the world's first psychiatric industrial complex. Suddenly, every county needed an asylum, every asylum needed patients, and every patient meant government funding. The math was simple. More madness equals more money. Dr. John Bucknell, the first commissioner of lunacy, watched asylum populations explode from 20,000 to over 100,000 in just 50 years. But here's the twisted part. Most of these people weren't actually insane by any medical standard. They were inconvenient, wives who talked back, melancholia, daughters who refused arranged marriages, hysteria, men who drank too much, moral insanity. The Victorian Diagnostic Manual was basically a catalog of social rebellion. Asylum superintendents became rich diagnosing personality traits as mental illness. The Hanwell Asylum charged families £100 per year, that's £12,000 in today's money, to cure their relatives. The Bethlem Royal Hospital, infamous Bedlam, turned patient visits into entertainment. Wealthy Londoners paid admission to gawk at the lunatics like animals in a zoo. Thomas Kirkbride, the architect behind those beautiful asylum designs, marketed his buildings as palaces for the insane. His sales pitch worked. American cities competed to build the most impressive Kirkbride asylum, turning human suffering into civic pride. But the real money wasn't in curing patients. It was in keeping them. Discharge rates hovered around 30%, and those cured often returned within months. The system needed permanent residents to justify permanent funding. Recovery became the enemy of profit. Private asylums offered premium services for premium prices. Ticehurst House charged £500 annually for genteel lunatics. Wealthy patients who received private rooms, fine dining, and recreational activities. Meanwhile, pauper lunatics crowded into county asylums, sleeping on straw mattresses in overcrowded wards. The Victorian asylum boom created a medical aristocracy. Superintendent physicians lived in mansion-style residences on asylum grounds, complete with servants and private gardens. They published journals, attended conferences, and built careers on experimental treatments. Their patients became laboratory specimens in humanity's most expensive medical experiment. By 1890, Britain operated 130 asylums housing 86,000 patients. The annual cost reached £2 million, more than the entire defense budget. Society had built a machine for manufacturing madness, and business was booming. The spinning chair of madness. Picture a medieval torture device disguised as medical equipment. That's exactly what Dr. Benjamin Rush created when he invented the tranquilizer chair in 1810. Rush, known as the father of American psychiatry, believed mental illness came from too much blood in the brain. His solution? Spin patients at high speed until they vomited, defecated, and passed out from terror. He called it centrifugal therapy. The chair looked innocent enough, wooden construction with leather straps and a rotating mechanism. But once patients were buckled in, the nightmare began. Attendants would spin the chair at 100 rotations per minute for up to 20 minutes straight. Imagine being trapped on the world's most sadistic carnival ride with no way to escape. Dr. Rush documented the effects with scientific precision. The patient becomes pale, then livid, pupils dilate, breathing becomes labored, and terror is extreme. He wrote this like it was a breakthrough, not systematic torture. The spinning chair spread across American asylums like wildfire. The McLean Asylum in Massachusetts installed 6 chairs in their treatment wing. The Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane used them daily. Rush's protege carried the technique to Europe, where it became standard practice. But here's where it gets truly horrifying. Doctors genuinely believed they were helping. The theory claimed centrifugal force would redistribute blood flow, calm violent patients, and cure delusions. Medical journals published glowing reviews. The American Journal of Insanity called it the most effective remedy for acute mania. Patient testimonies tell a different story. Sarah Miller, confined at Philadelphia's Blockley Almshouse, described the chair as a machine of hellish torment. She wrote, "The spinning never stops in your head, even hours after. You beg for death rather than another session." The chair sessions weren't random. Doctors used them as punishment disguised as treatment. Patients who refused medication, caused disruptions, or simply annoyed staff got strapped in. The threat of the chair kept entire wards in terrified compliance. Dr. Isaac Ray, another prominent psychiatrist, modified Rush's design with additional restraints. His version included a hood to prevent patients from seeing the spinning, making the experience even more disorienting. He proudly reported that patients emerged docile and manageable. The spinning chair remained standard psychiatric equipment for over 60 years. Medical schools taught the technique. Asylum superintendents competed to build the most efficient models. What started as one doctor's twisted theory became an entire profession's accepted practice. The last documented use occurred at the Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts in 1872, not because doctors realized it was torture, but because newer treatments promised better results. The chair was replaced by hydrotherapy, mechanical restraints, and eventually lobotomies. Rush's chair perfectly captured Victorian psychiatry's central delusion that brutality could be medicine if you use the right terminology. Torture became therapy, screaming became beneficial crisis, and terror became therapeutic breakthrough. Hydrotherapy hell. Water was supposed to be healing. Victorian doctors turned it into a weapon of mass psychological destruction. Dr. Vincenz Priesnitz popularized hydrotherapy in the 1840s, promising that water temperatures could cure everything from depression to delusions. What he actually created was a systematic method of human refrigeration that would make hypothermia look like a spa treatment. The surprise bath became every patient's worst nightmare. Attendants would drag unsuspecting patients to treatment rooms where freezing water waited in metal tubs. The shock was intentional. Doctors believed sudden temperature changes would reset disordered minds. Patients screamed, hyperventilated, and sometimes went into cardiac arrest. Medical staff called this therapeutic crisis. Ice baths pushed the torture even further. The Utica State Hospital in New York kept patients submerged in near-freezing water for hours. Dr. Ameria Brigham documented core body temperatures dropping to 95 degrees Fahrenheit, just 3 degrees above fatal hypothermia. He noted patients turned blue, stopped shivering, and entered states of semi-consciousness. This was considered progress. The continuous bath was hydrotherapy's crowning achievement of cruelty. Patients were placed in lukewarm water for 8 to 12 hours daily, sometimes for weeks. Their skin wrinkled beyond recognition, infections spread through open wounds, and muscle atrophy set in from lack of movement. The Philadelphia State Hospital kept detailed records. 23% of continuous bath patients developed severe skin conditions, 31% contracted pneumonia, and 12% died from complications. Dr. Simon Baruch, the father of American hydrotherapy, invented the needle shower. High-pressure water jets aimed at patients' heads and bodies. The force was strong enough to knock people unconscious. Baruch claimed it stimulated circulation and calmed agitation. Patient records describe it as water torture beyond human endurance. The temperature variations became increasingly extreme. The Worcester State Hospital alternated between scalding hot and ice-cold water treatments within the same session. Patients would be plunged into 110-degree water, then immediately transferred to 40-degree ice baths. The thermal shock caused seizures, heart palpitations, and sometimes permanent neurological damage. Hot pack treatments wrapped patients in blankets soaked with near-boiling water. The Danvers State Hospital used this method for hysterical females, women who showed any sign of emotional distress. The scalding fabric was wound tightly around patients' entire bodies, causing severe burns and blistering. Medical notes describe patients begging for mercy, while doctors recorded excellent therapeutic response. The wet sheet pack became standard procedure across American asylums. Patients were wrapped in cold, wet sheets and left immobilized for hours. As body heat dried the sheets, they contracted and tightened, creating a straitjacket effect. The psychological impact was devastating. Patients reported feeling buried alive. Dr. John Kellogg, yes, the cereal inventor, operated the Battle Creek Sanitarium where hydrotherapy reached peak insanity. His facility featured 50 different water treatments, including enemas with temperatures ranging from freezing to scalding. Patients received multiple treatments daily, sometimes spending 16 hours in various forms of water torture. The statistics were damning. The 1890 census of insane revealed that asylums using intensive hydrotherapy had mortality rates 40% higher than those using minimal water treatments. But doctors ignored the data, convinced that patient deaths were proof the treatments were working, eliminating the incurable cases. You don't learn this in history classes out there. Victorian hydrotherapy wasn't medicine. It was hypothermia disguised as healing, drowning disguised as therapy, and torture disguised as treatment. The same element that gives life was weaponized to destroy minds in the name of medical progress. The lobotomy factory. The Victorian era gave birth to humanity's most terrifying medical procedure, deliberately destroying healthy brain tissue to cure mental illness. What started as primitive skull drilling evolved into industrial-scale brain mutilation. Dr. Gottlieb Burckhardt performed the first recorded psychosurgery in 1888 at the Prefargier Asylum in Switzerland. His logic was brutally simple. If the brain causes mental illness, remove the problematic parts. He drilled holes into 6 patients' skulls and scooped out chunks of frontal cortex with a spoon. 1 patient died immediately. 2 suffered permanent paralysis. The others became vegetative shells of their former selves. The medical community was horrified, but not enough to stop. Burckhardt's technique spread to Britain, where Dr. William Norwood East refined the procedure at Broadmoor Hospital. East believed criminal insanity could be cured by removing brain tissue associated with aggression. His success rate was 0, but his documentation was meticulous. The real breakthrough came with Dr. Antonio Egas Moniz in 1935, who developed the leucotomy, the predecessor to the lobotomy. Moniz used alcohol injection to destroy neural pathways in the frontal lobe. His first patient, a 63-year-old woman with anxiety and depression, emerged from surgery unable to speak or recognize her family. Moniz called it a complete cure. Dr. Walter Freeman brought the procedure to America and turned it into a production line. His ice pick lobotomy could be performed in 10 minutes without anesthesia. Freeman would insert a surgical instrument through the eye socket, wiggle it around to sever brain connections, then move to the next patient. He performed 25 lobotomies in a single day at West Virginia's Weston State Hospital. The numbers are staggering. Between 1936 and 1967, over 40,000 Americans received lobotomies. The procedure was performed on housewives with postpartum depression, teenagers with behavioral problems, and elderly patients with dementia. Freeman alone performed 3,500 lobotomies, traveling the country in a van he called his lobotomobile. The Stockton State Hospital in California became America's lobotomy factory. Dr. Eugene Ziskind performed over 2,000 procedures, often on patients who were scheduled for discharge. His reasoning was chilling. Better to release a damaged patient than risk them returning to the community unchanged. The hospital's discharge rate improved dramatically, but at the cost of creating thousands of brain-damaged zombies. Patient records reveal the true horror. Mary Hammett, a 35-year-old mother of 3, was lobotomized for excessive worry about her children's welfare. Post-surgery notes describe her as calm, compliant, and emotionally flat. She spent the next 23 years in institutional care, unable to recognize her own children when they visited. The success criteria were obscene. Doctors measured improvement by patient compliance, not recovery. A successful lobotomy created docile, manageable patients who required minimal staff attention. The procedure didn't cure mental illness. It eliminated the capacity for complex emotions, creativity, and independent thought. Children weren't spared. Freeman lobotomized a 12-year-old boy for hyperactivity and defiance. The surgery left the child with severe intellectual disabilities, but Freeman proudly displayed before and after photos at medical conferences. The boy's transformation from difficult to manageable was presented as therapeutic triumph. The financial incentives were enormous. Lobotomies cost $200 per procedure, but saved thousands in long-term care costs. State hospitals pushed the surgery aggressively, sometimes performing it without family consent. The Wisconsin State Hospital lobotomized 1,000 patients in 5 years, reducing their care budget by 40%. International adoption was swift. Portugal made lobotomies mandatory for certain mental health conditions. The Soviet Union experimented with mass lobotomies for political dissidents. Japan performed thousands of procedures on institutionalized patients. The technique spread faster than any legitimate medical advancement in history. The lobotomy craze finally ended in the 1970s with the development of psychiatric medications, but the damage was permanent. Tens of thousands of people lived the rest of their lives with deliberately damaged brains, their personalities erased by doctors who genuinely believed they were helping. Agus Moniz won the Nobel Prize in 1949 for developing the lobotomy. The Nobel Committee called it one of the most important discoveries in psychiatric treatment. This wasn't ancient history, this was modern medicine's greatest failure, disguised as its greatest success. Life inside the walls. The daily routine inside Victorian asylums was designed to break human spirits with industrial efficiency. Every moment was controlled, every action monitored, every spark of individuality systematically crushed. Dawn arrived at 5 a.m. with the sound of keys jangling and heavy doors slamming. Patients were roused from straw mattresses by attendants carrying leather straps and wooden clubs. The morning inspection involved strip searches, head examinations for lice, and violent scrubbing with carbolic soap that burned skin raw. Those who resisted got their first beating of the day. Breakfast was a bowl of thin gruel, stale bread, and lukewarm water. Patients ate with their hands. Utensils were considered weapons. The dining hall held 200 people seated on wooden benches, watched by guards who clubbed anyone who spoke or moved too slowly. Meals lasted exactly 15 minutes. Unfinished food meant no food until the next meal. The work schedule was brutal. Male patients labored in asylum farms, chopping wood, hauling coal, and maintaining the grounds. Women worked in laundries, kitchens, and sewing rooms. This wasn't therapy. It was free labor that kept asylums profitable. Patients who collapsed from exhaustion were dragged to solitary confinement, not medical care. Recreation was a cruel joke. The airing court was a concrete yard surrounded by 20-foot walls where patients walked in circles for 1 hour daily. Conversation was forbidden. Guards watched from towers, shooting anyone who approached the walls. This was considered therapeutic exercise. The bathhouse became a weekly torture chamber. Patients were scrubbed with brushes until they bled, then doused with disinfectant that burned open wounds. The water was reused for dozens of patients without changing. Infection spread rapidly, but doctors blamed patient weakness rather than unsanitary conditions. Solitary confinement was the asylum's primary disciplinary tool. The strong room was a padded cell measuring 6 by 8 feet with no windows, no furniture, and no toilet. Patients were stripped naked and left for days or weeks. Food was pushed through a slot in the door. Human waste accumulated on the floor. The psychological damage was instantaneous and permanent. Medical rounds were theatrical performances of cruelty. Doctors would parade through wards with students, discussing patients like laboratory specimens. They would poke, prod, and examine patients without consent or explanation. Treatment decisions were made based on entertainment value rather than medical need. The restraint room contained devices that would shame medieval torturers. The crib was a cage-like bed that trapped patients inside wooden slats. The tranquilizer chair held patients immobile for hours. Straitjackets were standard equipment, applied so tightly they cut off circulation. Patients were restrained not for safety, but for staff convenience. Communication with the outside world was impossible. Letters were censored or destroyed. Visitors were screened and often turned away. Families were told their relatives were improving, regardless of their actual condition. The isolation was complete and intentional. Patients needed to disappear from society entirely. Patient testimonies revealed the psychological horror. Elizabeth Parsons, confined at the Massachusetts State Lunatic Hospital, wrote, "We are not treated as human beings, but as wild animals to be caged and controlled. The attendants take pleasure in our suffering. Each day feels like a lifetime in hell." The class system extended inside asylum walls. Wealthy patients received private rooms, better food, and gentler treatment. Poor patients were crowded into dormitories, fed scraps, and subjected to the harshest experimental treatments. Money determined not just comfort, but survival. Night brought no relief. Patients were locked in their rooms at sunset, often 14 hours of darkness in winter. The screaming never stopped. Cries of pain, terror, and despair echoed through corridors all night. Sleep was impossible. Exhaustion became another tool of control. The mortality rate told the real story. The Worcester State Hospital lost 30% of its patients within the first year. The Danvers State Hospital had mortality rates exceeding 40%. Death certificates listed natural causes, but surviving records described systematic neglect, abuse, and medical experimentation. Discharge was rarer than death. Only 15% of patients ever left Victorian asylums alive. Those who did were usually brain-damaged shells of their former selves, unable to reintegrate into society. The system was designed to be permanent, a human warehouse where society's problems were stored until they died. This was daily life for 100,000 British citizens in 1890, not criminals, not monsters, but people whose only crime was being different, difficult, or inconvenient. They disappeared into a system that promised healing but delivered systematic destruction of human dignity. The doctors who played God. Victorian asylum superintendents weren't just doctors, they were absolute monarchs ruling kingdoms of the mad. With zero oversight and unlimited power, they transformed medical practice into sadistic experimentation on a scale that would make Nazi doctors blush. Dr. Henry Cotton reigned over the Trenton State Hospital in New Jersey, like a medical dictator. His theory was simple: mental illness came from infected body parts. His solution was surgical removal of anything that might be diseased. Cotton ripped out patients' teeth, tonsils, gallbladders, colons, and reproductive organs. He performed over 11,000 therapeutic surgeries with a 30% mortality rate and called it groundbreaking treatment. Cotton kept meticulous records of his butchery. Patient files describe removing healthy organs from people suffering from depression, anxiety, and behavioral problems. A 19-year-old woman with excessive worry had her entire colon removed. She died 3 days later from infection. Cotton wrote in his notes, "Treatment successful. Patient no longer displays symptoms of mental distress." Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell developed the Rest Cure at the Philadelphia Orthopedic Hospital, a treatment that drove healthy women insane. Mitchell believed female hysteria came from too much mental activity. His cure involved complete isolation, forced bed rest, and a diet of milk and crackers. Patients were forbidden to read, write, or even sit up. Many developed severe depression and suicidal thoughts. Mitchell considered this proof his treatment was working. The mechanical restraint obsession reached peak insanity under Dr. John Buck at the London Asylum in Ontario. Bucky invented dozens of torture devices disguised as medical equipment. His restraining chair held patients immobile for weeks. His quieting bed was a wooden box with air holes that trapped patients like coffins. Bucky published papers describing how restraints calmed agitated minds, while patients died from muscle atrophy and bed sores. Dr. Isaac Curlin ran the Pennsylvania Training School for Feeble-Minded Children, where he conducted sterilization experiments on minors. Curlin believed mental illness was hereditary and performed castrations on boys as young as 8 years old. He sterilized over 200 children without parental consent, claiming he was preventing future generations of defectives. His work inspired Hitler's eugenics programs. The most notorious was Dr. Pliny Earle at the Northampton State Hospital in Massachusetts. Earle pioneered shock therapy decades before electroconvulsive treatment. He would terrorize patients with threats of violence, sudden loud noises, and staged executions. One technique involved making patients believe they were about to be hanged, then rescuing them at the last moment. Earle documented how this therapeutic terror made patients more compliant. Dr. William Tuke seems compassionate compared to his colleagues, but his moral treatment was psychological warfare disguised as kindness. At the York Retreat in England, Tuke created a system of rewards and punishments that conditioned patients like laboratory animals. Good behavior earned privileges. Bad behavior brought solitary confinement. The goal wasn't healing, it was creating perfect obedience. The power these doctors wielded was absolute. Dr. Thomas Kirkbride at the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane built his residence on asylum grounds, complete with servants and private gardens. He lived like royalty, while patients died in overcrowded wards. Kirkbride's salary was $5,000 annually, equivalent to $150,000 today, while spending just $2 per patient per week on food and care. Dr. Adolf Meyer, the father of American psychiatry, conducted experiments at the Worcester State Hospital that would violate every modern ethical standard. Meyer injected patients with foreign substances, performed unnecessary surgeries, and documented psychological responses to extreme stress. He published 200 papers based on human experimentation, building his reputation on patient suffering. The medical journals celebrated these monsters. The American Journal of Insanity published glowing reviews of Cotton's organ removals, Mitchell's Rest Cure, and Curlin's sterilizations. Professional conferences featured presentations on the latest torture techniques. The medical establishment didn't just tolerate these practices, it actively promoted them. Patient complaints were dismissed as symptoms of mental illness. When families questioned treatment methods, doctors claimed professional expertise that couldn't be challenged. Legal protections for patients didn't exist. Once committed, people became property of the asylum superintendent, who could do anything in the name of medical science. The corruption was financial as well as medical. Superintendents received kickbacks from medical supply companies selling restraint equipment. They embezzled government funding meant for patient care. The New York State Commission found that asylum superintendents were stealing 40% of their budgets while patients starved. Dr. Richard Dewey at the Milwaukee County Asylum embodied this corruption. He lived in a mansion while patients slept on straw. He hosted lavish parties for medical colleagues while denying patients basic nutrition. When exposed by investigators, Dewey claimed his lifestyle was necessary to attract quality medical professionals to asylum work. These weren't rogue doctors operating in isolation. They were the leading lights of Victorian psychiatry. They taught at medical schools, wrote textbooks, and trained the next generation of psychiatrists. Their legacy lived on long after their deaths, shaping mental health treatment well into the 20th century. The most chilling aspect wasn't their cruelty. It was their genuine belief that they were helping humanity. They saw themselves as pioneers, advancing medical science through bold experimentation. The fact that their experiments killed thousands of people was considered acceptable collateral damage in the war against mental illness. Those beautiful Victorian buildings still stand today. Many became universities, hotels, or luxury apartments. But walk through their halls, and you can almost hear the echoes of screaming that once filled those corridors for over a century. The asylum era officially ended in the 1960s with deinstitutionalization, but its shadow never left. The same attitudes that created spinning chairs and ice baths evolved into modern psychiatric abuse. Conversion therapy, solitary confinement in psychiatric units, and forced medication all trace their roots back to Victorian moral treatment. The financial incentives haven't disappeared either. Private psychiatric hospitals still profit from long-term commitments. Insurance companies still deny mental health coverage. Families still struggle with the cost of caring for relatives with mental illness. The machinery of disposal just became more sophisticated,